Hello and welcome to the Rabbit Hole podcast with Suibhne, episode number 8. A show that we start to do one topic in 1 week, and then we just never get through that topic and have to come back to it. But obviously in the next episode, we're not going to really stick to that topic, and we're just going to plunder wildly through endless different side topics as supplementary material to the main show. It is also the customary 30 seconds on this show where we have to wait and make sure that the delay comes through on our headphones so that we can make sure that we're actually live and that our microphone's actually live, because believe it or not, we have struggled with that in the past. So, last week we talked a bit about the Serbian Revolution, which was a climactic event of the birth or rebirth or continued birth of Serbian nationalism, the climactic event in at least that point in time. Because, of course, you can have many climaxes, and it also depends where you are in history, where you are in a period of time, because we're never at the end of history. We're never at the climax of history in that sense. There are multiple climaxes involved in history, and never mind, I'm getting a little bit sidetracked. So, already we had this beautiful artwork depicting the death of this famous Hajduk. If you want to get up to speed and catch up, you can go back to that episode. And the famous, or infamous, I should say, Skull Tower monument that was erected, this gruesome, horrible monument as a warning to the Serbs. Do not betray us. Do not rise up against us. Today we're going to talk a little bit about, there's this like little plucky little country down in the southern Balkans. The southern part, sort of in the bridge between the Albanian-dominated sphere and the Slavic-dominated sphere. There's this little plucky country called Montenegro, which up until this point we've sort of been neglecting, have we not? It's a real shame, and I do feel shame. I am ashamed of myself for forgetting about plucky little Montenegro, because it actually has like an incredibly important story in the history of Serbia and the Serbs as a whole. Of course, the Serbs as a nation, a nation around which you could draw a little line if you had a little bit of a pencil to draw a line around people, which is what the exercise in building a state is. Hello, Rand so far away. Nice to see you here. So, plucky little Montenegro it would be within that circle. It would be within that line that you drew around, because of course the Serbs as a people can trace their roots to living on all sorts of parts of the Balkans, including of course Dalmatia and Slavonia and Croatia and Bosnia and Herzegovina and Albania and Kosovo and North Macedonia, just all over the bloody shop. All right, let's get to it. Plucky little Montenegro played an important role in the Serbian Revolution. It joined in on the fight, and it became this inseparable ally from the Serbs during their period of revitalized national expression. But what we didn't really talk a bit about Montenegro. It's sort of this forgotten piece, this tiny little coastal principality for most of its history. And if you're coming over here from the main video, so this is all going to be sort of supplementary to the main video. So one day in the far off future, you'll be able to come over here and have a look at this, these podcasts as supplementary material. I had to skip over a lot of Montenegro. And the problem was that it was very difficult to focus on the separate stages of development in different territorial pieces. So when the Serbian Empire collapsed, you sort of have one very centralized not centralized in the political sense, but centralized in essence of being like having one emperor, Dushan the Mighty. Essentially, he had absolutely no rivals for his internal power. And going from that to the destruction and collapse of the Serbian Empire is you have several different threads to pull to look at Serbian development. So we've talked a little bit about the Serbian development in the military frontiers along the borders of Austria, as well as within the diets of Hungary and Austria. So the imperial center of diplomatic efforts in those diets, and most of it is centered around Karlovci, this city in Vojvodina today. And also, we talked a little bit about the origin of the Haiduks and that sort of thing. And this was this is the core part of what makes the modern Serbian nation state. But of course, that wasn't the only place the Serbs were expressing their political outreach. They were also doing so in the parts of the military frontier that, of course, make up modern-day Croatia and Slavonia, and as well as Bosnia and Herzegovina, where they actually made up the majority of the population of those areas during the turn of the 19th century, I want to say. So the 1800s and 1900s is when the Serbs made up a definitive majority, or plurality, I should say. I don't think they made up more than 50%, but they were certainly the largest ethno-religious group. So this is the trouble with doing these things is you have to sort of divide each political expression and development within different sections of the Balkans. And one of those places, of course, is Little Montenegro. So if we jump into our map, because you know how much I love maps, this is where we left off last week. Down here at the bottom, so you've got the Obrenović establishment of the semi-independent Principality of Serbia. But down here in blue, near the coast, you'll see that there is a little piece of blue territory. This is, of course, what is known as the Prince Bishopric of Montenegro. And it is almost entirely surrounded by Ottoman territory. So you have Ottoman Albania and Ottoman Herzegovina. And down below it is the Bay of Kotor. And the Bay of Kotor is, let's see if I can get myself organized. So this is the Bay of Kotor right around here. And this at the time has sort of fluctuated in its control. It was dominated economically a lot of the time by Ragusa, which is the city state that was founded in modern day Dubrovnik, but much longer than that, it was dominated by Venice. Venice was this obviously massive naval trading power up here in the top of the northern section of the Adriatic. Is this the Adriatic? Yeah, the Adriatic Sea. You have this little inlet here called the Venetian Lagoon, and in there is plucky little Venice, which managed to absolutely dominate Mediterranean trade for most of the sort of late Middle Ages to early Enlightenment period, that sort of time. And this is one of the areas where, the Serbs fled to. They fled to the Dalmatian coast. They'd occupied the Dalmatian coast for a long time. The Orthodox Church has a long history in the Dalmatian coast, but generally speaking, very dominated by Romance speakers, as well as the Catholic Church. The Serbs had always made somewhat of a minority, but because you had these large trading cities that very much dominated trade on the coastline, that made for a very wealthy merchant class in these cities, and they also had quite a big hand in dominating the politics of the Baltic. So some of the oldest roads in the Balkans they can trace their roots to these trade routes to and from the big cities. So places like Split, Dubrovnik, which was, of course, known as Ragusa. the Ragusan Republic, which was this Dalmatian semi-independent city-state that had a sort of a kind of republican government, which we talked a bit about in the Croatia video. These Adriatic-facing city-states, or little like trade cities, had an outsized influence in purely based on their trading power and their concentration and control of the flow of wealth. And they were also where a lot of the financiers come from. Obviously, if you have a concentration of wealth, that means you have the ability to start doling out finance and starting to charge interest on that finance. It's all very finance-based and all very financial institutions and banks that trace their roots to these things. But also, I don't know. Don't ask me. Not a finance historian or any kind of historian, really. So let's go back a bit and look at the origins of Montenegro. So it's one of these pieces. Look at this. We actually have a map with some labels on it. I've been hard at work finishing the last pieces of the main video. So if you're coming here from the main video, you already see and appreciate all the meticulous hard work from me, the best YouTuber. We actually have some labels to make things a lot easier for these live streams, because now I actually know where we are and what we're doing. So the area around the Bay of Kotor and this large inland lake, which is essentially just sort of an inlet, coastal inlet to this large lake. I think it's called the Skada Lake or Skoturi Lake. I can't remember. It's got different names in different languages to essentially refer to this one sort of big inland lake. And a lot of bishoprics were seated in this. This is what was historically called Duklja. Now, Duklja is a transliteration from the older Roman name for this area, which was Dioclea, which is related to Diocletian, the emperor. And this was a very important part of the Roman Empire, the trade networks that ran through this area, as well as the very old ecclesiastical center of power. So it was the seat of bishoprics and principalities that trace their roots very far away. Because, of course, when the Roman Empire collapsed, there were these... It wasn't just like one day okay, all the Romans are just gone, snap your fingers. No, there's like cities and independent sort of pieces of territory that survive. It's one of the reasons why like the Latin-based languages survived on the Adriatic coast for such a long time, because they had... sort of fled to these easily defensible locations on the coast. They were protected to their north by the Dinaric Alps, as well as the general rugged terrain of the Balkans more generally, fled behind the walls of big cities, and then generally protected themselves, and then had to protect themselves even more from pirates, and you have to set up a navy, and if you have a navy, you can do a lot of trade. So that kind of thing. So these kinds of things generally have a through line of continuity with the Roman Empire. Eventually, they all get snapped up by Venice. But prior to that, these little tiny Serbian or early Slav states that exist, the core is around Raška, but that's not the core of where political and economic power is at that time. Raška only really arises as a power much later into the history of the Serbs. The real power early on was from this a principality called Hum, or like the Župan of Hum, and it's like also known as Zahumlje, which I could be mispronouncing, and Pagania, and Travunia, and Duklja. These were the coastal principalities of what we would call Dalmatia. So at the time, this is the Dalmatian coast, and Duklja, or what will be later known as Zeta, depending on where the seat of power is at any given time. This is a very early, powerful principality. It is where the first king originates, and that Serbia has its in Serbian historiography. It's one of its župans, which basically just means sort of like duke or sort of lord or that kind of thing. It is originally it's got a more of a military role, the word Jupan, and then it eventually becomes sort of like this tribal, princely, just sort of a rank of nobility. And he decides he's going to break with the Constantinople Patriarch. This is when there was this big split happening in the Catholic and the Orthodox spheres of influence. You got the Patriarch in Constantinople and the Pope in Rome, which I don't know if he was in Rome at the time, but whatever. So he decides he's going to ask the Pope for a crown, and he's going to get himself crowned as the first king of Duklja, and he becomes really powerful. The Byzantines and the Bulgarians, not big fans of this new kingdom, and they slowly erode its economic and secular power, and eventually it falls away. And there was this big civil war between the rival princes within the various Jupans, and the Byzantines eventually settle on installing a new prince in Rashka. So they give him the title, they sort of recognize him as Grand Jupan. And that's usually translated into English as Grand Prince. Now, Grand Prince is basically the big runaround way of calling the Serbian prince. Basically, he's a monarch. It's equivalent to king in everything but name. So the title of king in Latin is Rex. So if you get the title Rex, that basically means you're recognized as king. And this is a title that, again, goes back to the Roman Empire. And it's one of those ones that they would often recognize. Like the Romans would often recognize leaders of some barbarian tribe as Rex, and then Rex also becomes this thing, you get a Rex Romanorum, which is a title that a lot of German kings have in the Middle Ages. Rex Romanorum basically just means king of the Romans. The Romans, of course, being code for everything from northern Germany down to middle Italy, which is very confusing. But ignoring that for the time being, they decide that they're going to give the leader of Rashka, which was related to the king of Duklja, part of the same family, I think, and they decide they're going to be the Grand Jupans, which essentially just it's king without saying king. It's basically dancing around the term king because, of course, the Eastern Empire was far more Greek. They didn't use the term Rex as much, so they're sort of just trying to get them on side. And this is essentially how the power gravitates away from this coastal Dalmatian city-esque place and into the hinterland, or over those mountainous regions, the Alps, into what is Ras and Rashka. And they are a constituent part of the Balkans, of the Serbian states. They often have power exercised on them by the more powerful rulers of Serbia, but it does swing to and fro a little bit. But Venice definitely comes in to dominate those states. So you can see in the Bay of Kotor here, this is controlled by Venice. Venice was nominally subordinate to the Eastern Romans, which is why it's colored in purple. They obviously started to express a lot more independence and de facto independence, but legally, on paper, they were still part of the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantines, nominally supportive of the emperor in Constantinople. Duklja becomes the seat of the bishopric of Zeta and becomes this integral part of the Serbian Empire. So Serbia grows and grows, and it sort of shrinks in significance in terms of, like, it's sort of still a constituent part and very much like a ceremonial county and ruled by a Župa who's like going to be appointed by the Serbian monarchy. And eventually Serbia gets really powerful as they sort of turn on their allies and become very, very intertwined into the monarchy and the nobility of Hungary. Essentially, this second little kingdom is set up to the north of Serbia, covering most of today's like actual, central Serbia, and this is called Sirmia, and it comes from what in Serbian you call Srem, which is Sirmium, which is this ancient Roman city on the Danube or the Sava. Actually, I think it's the Sava or the Danube. There, I can't actually remember. So. No, I think it is the Danube. So this is the central part of this kingdom of Sirmia, which basically is like the waiting king gets to have that part of territory, and they're directly subordinate to the Hungarian king. That is really clever because it allows whoever's in charge, like the Prince of Wales. Imagine the Prince of Wales in England, which is the title given to the heir in waiting, the heir apparent to the throne. Imagine if that piece of Wales was like hereditarily linked and subordinate to France. You could basically say that the French would have a lot of influence on what the future policies of England would be if they have sort of a lot of control and influence over the heir apparent. That's kind of what happened. That's a very much an oversimplification, but that's kind of what happened. All these lands along the northern part of Serbia and Bosnia were given as a fief to the heir in waiting, this junior king, so like a junior Rex. And the junior Rex would be just waiting for things to go bad with their dad or whomever is on the throne, and then they would rebel. And this is one of the things that's very interesting about this part of Serbian history, is that very few of the kings actually just die. A lot of them are just overthrown, not necessarily with Hungarian involvement, but almost certainly with Hungarian background meddling in their affairs. And that's one of the things one of the most powerful tools that they have to control Serbia. But Serbia gets really powerful, and it as the Hungarians sort of wax and wane in power, and vice versa with the Roman Empire, they wax and wane in power as well. Serbia and Bulgaria sort of come in to fill the void. They come in to nab lots of formerly Roman territory, and that's how they get really powerful. And also smuggling. They were one of the main ports for smuggling for some reason. I guess because they had sort of friendly nobility on the other side of the border, and the Hungarians were like, I don't want to pay to get my goods into Roman markets. So all these ancient Roman towns along here had a lot of they dominated the economic trade, like I was saying before. They were very rich, they were very populous, there was big markets for purchasing that kind of thing. And you got to get where the good money is happening. And to export it and not want to pay the dues or the taxes, you just shave a little bit off the top, give it to the local Serbian ruler of whatever area over here, and you smuggle it across the border. And that's essentially where a lot of Serbia's wealth comes from, because of course Serbia is going back and forth and having sort of this trading balance where they export a lot of livestock. The Vlachs in the hills herding sheep and cheese and that kind of thing, and they don't herd the sheep. The cheese comes out of the sheep. They don't herd the sheep. The sheep do not roam the Dinaric Alps in large flocks of cheese wheels or anything like that. No, they're making the cheese as a byproduct of the flocks that they have. I should make that clear. So they were trading cheese to and fro, trading livestock and fur and wool and that kind of stuff. It's all very good, all very economic. So eventually Dušan's empire comes to the fore. We talked a bit about that last time, and this had remained for a long time. This had remained a core part of the Serbian monarchy. And then, of course, the Ottomans came along and destroyed everything. It's all very sad. The Serbian Empire collapses, and they write a lot of songs and poetry about it. So how does that relate to the Serbian Revolution? The Gulf of Kotor was a place where the Venetians had most of their control, and they were bordered by a heck of a lot of clans. Now, what are the clans? probably the most unhelpful term. You've got Serbia's central authority collapses, and in amongst that, in amongst the origin of what we call Montenegro, and also little bits of actually Herzegovina and Bosnia, there is a big explosion of these things called clans. Now, when you have a collapse in authority, you suddenly have to start shrinking down into what you're gonna how your society is going to function. You shrink down into these smaller units, especially when the collapse of the empire and the monarchy is not just replaced by some internal monarchy. No, it's being replaced by an invading force, a religiously different, economically different, culturally different, linguistically different invading force that takes over. So the shrinking of the state happens to such a degree that you have these refugees from societies forming these familial clans. So the way as soon as the Ottomans take over, there started to become this huge disparity between the areas that they would consider urban and prosperous and filled with people, which is the very farming region, the areas that are dependent on farming and cereal grains and cereal crops and that kind of thing, and then the mountainous cattle breeding areas and sheep breeding and cheese breeding, of course, the wheels of cheese along the Dinaric Alps. This is a huge problem for the Ottoman Empire. They can't extend their power up into those mountains in the same way that they can down in the farming villages and valleys below. So down in the urbanized areas, so these vast farming estates and valleys and cities, that kind of thing, all of the Christians there are classed as one area, and they're engaged in a feudal relationship with their local lord. So whoever is the local owner of that land, in a sense, and that is eventually subordinate all the way up to the Ottoman Sultan. And the relationship is very comparable to the relationship as a feudal lord. My thoughts are all over the place today, and my mouth is very dry. So these farming areas, there's a big exercise of Ottoman power along against those people, and that's why a lot of these fleeing and migration episodes take place. These people want to fear, they fear the Turks. The Turks are destroying a lot of their property during the conquests, and they're taking over their villages, burning down their villages, causing refugee crises, and then settling new people along wherever they can. That is basically the playbook of a lot of imperial powers. They will come in and take over the urbanized segments of society to express their power. And then everybody else that can flees to the hills or flees away. These parts of the former Serbian state were originally inhabited by indigenous Balkan peoples. Now, what the heck is an indigenous Balkan peoples? So before the Serbian state, before the Slavs, the area was inhabited by, these Illyrians, and then they were Romanized. Some to this day, I think, Albanian historians will consider the Albanian language one of the few remnants of the Illyrian linguistic continuum that would have happened, which is, who knows if that's even true. There's pretty much no consensus on whether or not there was a unified Illyrian language or linguistic continuum at all. So it's dubious on scholarship, but the Albanians, or at least the ancestors of the Albanians, are among the people that we would consider to be indigenous Balkan peoples. Among the others would be the Vlachs. So these were Romanized indigenous Balkan peoples that adopted the Latin language or dialects of Vulgar Latin, and eventually became fled to the hills when the Slavs arrived to get away from them in the first place. As you can see, history echoes. It's like it rhymes. It's very it happens over and over again when newcomers will come in and they'll flood the valleys and towns and rivers and that kind of thing, and then everybody else flees to the hills. which we've talked about a few times. So the word Vlach comes from a German word, a Germanic word, which means foreigner, which is again very unhelpful. So when the Germans arrived, they sort of said, "Oh, who are these guys? Oh, these are foreigners." So they used the word Vlach, and that word stuck as basically meaning, they're not us. They can't speak what we speak, which is one of those things that actually comes in a lot of linguistic names, exonyms for people. So exonym means like what you call somebody else, and endonym means what you call yourself. Exonyms relating to the word Vlach are present. I think Wales may even have a link to that word, because the English is obviously a Germanic language as well, and they would have just referred to the Welsh speakers as foreigners, and I think that's where the word Wales comes. Somebody can correct me in the comments if I'm wrong, but it's also where the word Vlach comes. Sorry. It's also where the word Wallachia comes from, or Wallachia. So you can see this southern section of Romania. This is a section where the Vlachs would eventually dominate and give their name to the region of Wallachia, and it becomes a principality and eventually forms a constituent part of the Kingdom of Romania. Vlachs were all over the Balkans. They were everywhere. They were among the most numerous of the populations of the Balkans, but they generally were semi-nomadic. And what that means is they traveled from place to place, village to village, hill to hill, trading, trying to avoid taxation, trying to avoid having to pay for things that they would otherwise just sort of keep to themselves. And that's sort of one of the very many origins of clan societies. Clan societies are essentially like extended families. They're little like mafia gangs that roam around from place to place, and they have deals with each other and familial relations. And some of the oldest like laws that applied to the whole territory of the Serbian Empire and the Serbian monarchy is like, we don't marry Vlachs. Stop marrying Vlachs. I've got disturbing reports here in the castle that our good Christian people are marrying Vlachs, and who the heck knows how much that extended, how much of a real problem this was, or if the jury's out on whether or not this was a big problem. But this, of course, doesn't work. People married Vlachs all the time. The Vlachs became very Slavicized over time. Initially, it's mostly religious. They sort of adopt the Orthodox Church in large numbers, but initially, this like the maintenance of their religion, their language is very strong, and their culture and traditions. But they also would have been harbingers of heresies, like church heresies, and that kind of thing. It's a lot harder to stamp out heresies if you're migrating all the time, if you don't have a control over the population, the same way the church had a control over what's being taught in churches in the valleys and cities. The Vlachs were everywhere, all the way up into Romania, into Hungary, Croatia, Bosnia, all the way down to the tippy end of Greece. The Vlachs were a huge proportion of the population. Like, we don't know how many, obviously, but like there's like place names and family names and clan names that trace their roots that are Vlach or Romance in origin. This becomes a big problem for when the Turks are taking over. The majority of the farming population were given the status of reya, which, in English, the closest term would be a serf, and they were obliged to serve the local appointed Turkish or Muslim leader. Sometimes they were Serb, sometimes the Serb would convert to Islam, and they would gain the privileges that way. But generally speaking, they were often settled peoples. So the Ottoman Empire eventually conquers all this area, but the Vlachs don't really go away. They become an integral part of the trading network that the Ottomans use. So the cattle breeding areas, the cattle breeding people had a privileged position, which allowed them to preserve that culture. They were given these privileges to be able to move across vast pastures and that kind of thing. They were allowed to be to maintain that thing, and that's the kind of thing is that's one of the most important ways that the Ottomans were so successful, because they didn't just sort of treat these people as like brigands and renegades and what kind of that kind of thing and what have you. No, they worked with them and they gave them semi-legal recognition, that kind of thing. And this allowed the pre-existing legal structures to continue. And the patriarchal system that these clans operated in, these little mafia gangs, you always, whenever you talk about like organized crime and mafia syndicates today, you're very much talking about like patriarchy. And basically, you have a patriarch, the head of this clan, in whatever enterprise they happen to be in, whether it be a protection racket, as in the mafia would turn out to be, or whether it be cheese. If you're controlling the supply of cheese, that becomes a link to power that that these vlachs have. The patriarchal obedience that extends out, and they're essentially just these extended families. So it was also the Albanians, the Vlachs and Albanians live in these ethnic communities neighboring the Slavic communities, and they trade with them. They're giving them cheese, and the former Župans, the Župas, which are these territorial administrative parts of the Serbian Empire, eventually they spread into those former Župas and then adopt the name of that Župa. So sometimes you'll have like a former Župa of this specific river. Now that's the clan's name. Okay, so that you'll have that kind of clan area, and then other times they'll bring their already established clan name into an area. So an area's former name will completely disappear, and it'll become known by the clan's name. So it happens in both directions. Now, the majority of these clan people have their origins as Albanians and Vlachs and Aramani. Aramani is just like sort of another word for Vlach, as far as I can tell. The Aramani is like basically, it sort of just means like Roman, and I think that's another exonym that is applied to Romance-speaking peoples in different parts of the Balkans. I think Aramani is the word that dominates in Greece, for example, and that's the term that comes to be used as an exonym. And one of the clans in Herzegovina and Montenegro, Pashtrovic, is a clan. That means it comes from the word possibly pasture. Pasture is a word linked to shepherding and migrating cattle and migrating cheese. When you need to move your flock of cheese from one place to another, you're moving them from one pasture to another, which is where you get that expression like greener pastures. So the Ottomans also used the Vlachs as warriors. And that is one of the things that when you have all of these Serbs fleeing across the border to go fight for the Habsburgs and the Austrians and the Hungarians, you need to fill that void for military duty, and Vlachs is one of those things. As these Vlachs spread around, they're becoming increasingly Slavicized. And the jury's out onto basically how much of a Slavicization happens. Did it happen very early on? Did it happen completely? Who knows? The jury's out on that. But we do know that a huge component of the Serbian diaspora comes from these Vlachs who also spread around and flee and move around and blah blah blah. They adopt the Orthodox Church in far greater numbers than they had before. And what that means is when they spread and they flee into the into the Austrian Empire, and the privileges start being granted to the Orthodox Church, which is one of the ways that the Serbs maintain their identity and autonomy, the Vlachs get caught up in that too. So when the Vlachs they stop identifying much with their sort of pasture raising history as they migrate into Austria and just settle in among the clans of the Serbs. So this is just one of those interesting things where among the when you have the Serbian state, you sort of have very two distinct peoples. One is in the valleys, you have the Serbs, and in the hills, you have the Vlachs. And they're generally both subjects to the Serbian emperor, but they're very different linguistically and a little bit culturally, but they're neighbors, right? And then when they collapse and migrate, they sort of form into one, because now the thing that's keeping them together is their orthodoxy and the privileges that they're granted as Orthodox. They sort of assimilate into one and just become Serbs. And this is one of those really just fascinating things. The Turkish census of Herzegovina in 1477, so this is when they're just sort of taking over the southern middle section of the Balkans. So this is Herzegovina right here. When the Turks do a census, they found that a lot of villages were registered as Vlach, and others were deserted, and others were listed as Serb. Most of the ones that are deserted are listed as Serb. So that also goes to show that there's this weird transfer of populations that sort of happens organically as well as by intention later on. Where are you going to get the people to settle other than the hills? If you're going to look for people to settle, one of the places you're going to look at is the hills of people who didn't migrate quite as much. And you're going to say, hey, come and settle in this area. And they become increasingly Serbicized with time. So these migrations happen, and you have these things called a katun, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. And a katun is basically an extended family. It is the where the word clan comes from, but in essence related to like a piece of territory. Another word is like I think it's like plemena, which means like clan or extended family. Do you see why this is very like related to what I was saying about the mafia? It's very much this patriarchal system of like extended families, and of course they do intermarry and that kind of thing. But it's one of those things where they're not. They're maintaining the structures, and some of them die out, some of them go extinct, that kind of thing, and some of their new ones originate. So it's hard to keep track of these migrating clans, especially because they're on the move all the time. It's hard to pin down exactly for any like settled people, whether it be the Ottomans or the Austrians that come later. It's very hard for them to like get a distinct picture on this. It's like putting your finger on a ball of mercury. You know, you push it down and it eventually just moves around and moves to a different spot. So the Slavicization of the Katuns happen in the Balkan population, and it's also one of the reasons is because they would also gain these privileges. So the Ottomans are looking into the hills, and they're bringing these people down from the hills to essentially become part of their administration, and being granted titles like Voivoda and Knez, which are obviously Slavic titles that eventually make their way into these Vlach communities. The Župa sort of disappears and is replaced by place names related to clans. Very unhelpful for people who are historians and love maps like me. They were in constant turmoil. They were fighting with each other constantly, like little mafia gangs. They would some clans would take over others. Some would marry into others, and some would conquer others. It was mayhem. And there's all of these clans essentially occupy this hinterland outside the Bay of Kotor. This vast area surrounding the Bay of Kotor and the Lake Skadar is dominated by these clans. The clans very much dominate in Herzegovina, this very mountainous region here, and what is now Montenegro, obviously. But they're very much have what they have this tradition and history linking themselves back to the Serbian Empire. They tell stories and songs. They weren't very well educated. They were rural, pastoral nomads or semi-nomads, obviously. So education was nil. And when the collapse of writing happens, how do you communicate history? You communicate it in the oral tradition mostly. And one of the ways it's done is songs, because songs and poems, you can easily remember them. Everyone like remembers nursery rhymes for their kid from when they were a kid, because you learned how to sing them, and you learned the tune, and you learned the rhymes. That's essentially how history is passed down, and through that you have this incredible mythologization of Serbian history, and that's one of the reasons why everything linked to the sacred dynasty is birthed in this time. All this like folklore and tradition is that links the Serbian Empire to the sacred dynasty, the House of Nemanjić, and the Battle of Kosovo is spread through this tradition, through music and poetry and dancing and ritual and telling scary ghost stories around the campfire at night. It's entertainment, and the spreading of these clans all over the Balkans is one of the reasons why the Kosovo story spreads, and why the cult of the sacred dynasty becomes so intense. And that's sort of the picture that I have here on screen, which I made disappear for some reason. Oh, there it is. So this is just sort of a rendition of what like the inside of a Serbian monastery looks like. There's obviously loads of different Serbian monasteries where you have these enormous like frescoes and painted reliefs and that sort of thing, depicting the history of the Serbian people and the Serbian church and the Serbian monarchy, with a lot of emphasis on the sacred dynasty. It becomes this cult, and each center of the monastic communities within the Balkans, within Serbia, becomes they become personality cults to whichever patron is either reported to have endowed that monastery, or is rumored to have been buried there, or sometimes has been buried there. And these two things, you got these clan societies, these very patriarchal clan societies that have a poetic and linguistic link to their history as part of the sacred dynasty, and then the churches and monasteries. These are the two pillars of which Serbian nationalism is built upon. And when that happens, you get these weird blendings of traditions and ideas. The Venetians down here in the Bay of Kotor, generally speaking, control that area most of the time throughout its history. And one of the ways that the clans in Herzegovina and Montenegro survive is because they cooperate with the Venetians generally. Sometimes the Ottomans would come in and subjugate the clans, but a lot of times the clans would rise up yet again in a little while, and they would often get help and economic contributions from Venice, because obviously Venice stands to benefit any time that the Montenegrins, the Serbian clans would rise up against the Ottomans. And these old institutions and practices that are reestablished within the clan societies form a huge part of the cultural inheritance that the Serbs undergo and the Montenegrins undergo. So they bring back these old Slavic practices. This is also when like folklore outside of Christendom flourishes. So when you're talking about like fairy tales and ghost stories and that kind of thing, that flourishes during this time, because obviously they're embracing a sort of like non-linguistic tribal society, and that kind of stuff always spreads in those kind of societies because people are like, telling stories and passing down knowledge. Yeah. Mil I Meta. So video on Balkan transhumance pastoralism would be awesome. Yeah. So that was a word that I was kind of avoiding using for a little while, because in essence what we're talking about is transhumance. Transhumance is the process by which you go into the higher areas, as in the hills and the mountains, these inaccessible areas, for pasture as you migrate, and then when those passes and things become inaccessible, when the weather changes, you migrate to lower areas. And that is essentially what's happening over time, as well as over vast geographic areas. So transhumance pastoralism flourishes during this time. And I think it's all quite fascinating. But, for some reason, the Serb historians are reluctant to use that term. And the only time I've ever come across that term in my reading is from non-Serb historians talking about the area. And I don't know why. I wonder if that's linked to anything. So when the little tiny towns within the Balkans that were part of the Serbian Empire sort of granted some version of autonomy, they're often referring back to Dušan's Code. So Dušan's Code was this supposed to be ecumenical, universal marriage between Serbian law and Roman law when he built his empire. So sometimes that was maintained in smaller communities, because the smallest subunit of the Balkan communities were allowed to have a Serb Orthodox leader, but that was sort of ceremonial most of the time. Sometimes they would have a little bit of power, but most of the times it was just sort of nominal power, wasn't it? It was the real power was in the hands of the upper administrative units, the Sapahis, the Sanjaks, the Beys, the what have you and what have you not. That's where the real power lies in the Ottoman administrative system, down to the smallest unit, the village. Sometimes you could have a local Serb who didn't need to convert to Islam or anything like that to maintain their power. And one of the ways that they exercised their power was with Dušan's Code, and it was adapted to these little autonomous communities, and some of those were under Venetian rule. So there is a little bit of continuity with the Serbian Empire in that way, but with the clans, there is no continuity at all, in legalistic continuity at all. So where is the continuity coming from? Like I said before, it's coming from linguistic. Eventually, they're very Slavicized, and religious continuity. They're still very much Orthodox. They're still embracing a lot of these. You're running around and you're doing economic transhumance, pastoralism, and you're coming into contact with these monasteries, and they're very physical, protected remnants of the Serbian church that are still functioning and still being maintained to various degrees. So there's different maintenance of the state, but a lot of dancing and stuff like that, a lot of cultural traditions, and some Serb historians credit these clans for maintaining links to the Slavic folklore and traditions, non-Christian, that kind of thing. If that is true, that is almost certainly completely made up. Any memory, any cultural memory of pre-Christian Slavic cultural expression is fictitious. It's made up by these people. They would have had no cultural memory of their pre-Christian existence, and if they did, they probably wouldn't have given it too much thought. So any time that a clan would try to embrace aspects of Slavic culture that were considered to be sort of pre-Christian, chances are it was an exercise in fiction more than actually trying to link themselves to the pre-Slavic history. And that is totally fine. It's one of those things that happens all over the place when people become when countries and places prosper in the age of nationalism. They often embrace a fictitious version of their history. And sometimes it's based on actual, real, recorded evidence from the past. But these clan societies would have not had any access to anything like that, and resources are scarce to begin with. A lot of their links again to the past are mostly based in songs, poetry, and the church. And sometimes by claiming to be descendants of some old noble. And that's obviously a lot easier to do if a local area, if the clan becomes known by the local area or Jupan or Jupa, that is a lot easier to do because there's obviously a cultural memory of who ruled that area. And if you have poetry and hymns and that kind of thing linking that area to one specific Serbian ruler that actually existed in history, it's a lot easier to say, well, we're descendants of that, and we're clearly descendants of that particular ruler. Even if that's just completely false, it serves a very strong cultural continuity with those former rulers, nobility, Serbian nobility, which by and large would have either, fled many centuries ago by this point, but remnants of it remain in the cultural memory. There is a flourishing of these clans, the clan societies, and they eventually become the nucleus of what we call the Montenegrin state. So Montenegro is the Black Mountain. So Montenegro in Latin, Monte means mount, and Negro means black mountain, and it's named after. The theory goes that it's named after a specific mountain on the coast, sort of near the Bay of Kotor, which is called Lovchen, and this is a mountain that was covered in dense forests, and the forests were so dense that it looked black from a distance. And that was one of these markers. So if you're like a Venetian sailor sailing up and down the coast, you see oh, look, there's the Black Mountain, there's the Montenegro. And this is also the term that is used in Serbian, Crna Gora, which means Black Mountain. Now, I have a little bit of a theory. One of the historical rulers, one of the historical Jupa of this area, also has a name. The family that once ruled Montenegro is called I can't remember it now. I'm just going to do a quick Google. Why am I blanking on it? Yeah. So one of these old houses that in the Middle Ages rules the Principality of Zeta is the House of Crnojević. And they're descending from they were initially a cadet branch of an older house. I can't remember the name of that house at the moment. And they essentially become powerful during the reign of, like many of these clans, they actually become very, very powerful during the reign of Stefan Dušan. And Dušan the Mighty, he is the emperor where a lot of Serbian nobility trace their roots to. Obviously, the clans themselves go back further, but they're really become really powerful during that time. And Crnojević, the word Crno means black. So I am curious as to their link. I have not. I was doing a little bit of research on this yesterday. I have not found a definitive link as to where the origin of that name comes from. I know it's adopted as a cadet branch of an older house, and the first name of the leader of that family is where are you? So the older part of the family is Jorašević. Apologies for the pronunciation. My voice is going. And the older family eventually gets transferred to the patriarch of that clan or a noble house is Crnoje Jorašević, and his first name obviously has the word Crno in it, and that means black in the Serbian language. So I am curious if there is any sort of link to that, and I haven't really been able to find that. So if you're an expert on Serbian history and you know if there is a link between that old Serbian family and Crna Gora, the Black Mountain, please let me know. I'd be very interested to read more about it. So the Serbs are eventually developing this nationalism, and Um, over here, down in the bottom, in Montenegro, my notes are all over the shop. Okay, so the Gulf of Kotor is where the Venetian authorities are, and they are bordered by all these clans, and they're supplying the clans with economic help and weaponry and that kind of thing. Eventually, these clans decide that they're gonna meet together every year or every couple of years, and they meet together in a zbor. And zbor just sort of means like assembly. It's sort of the Serbian or Slavic word for assembly or parliament or grouping together of all these like patriarchs. So all the patriarchs will get together at a set time and decide things in a sort of like weird semi-democratic way. Just gonna break a second for some water. Excuse me. So they meet together, and one of the places that they really start to focus in on is the Metropolitan of Zeta. So that was the name of the local bishop that inhabited this area. He was subordinate, obviously, originally to the Patriarchate of Peć, which was the Serbian church, and this becomes like one of the focal points of the Montenegrin clans. They decide that they're going to start meeting together for their little parliament, for their zbor, at this Cetinje monastery, which is high up in the hills of Montenegro. And what that does, in many ways, is link the secular clan power to the power of the church. We talked a little bit about the Serbian migration episode, where all of these like massive migrations happened across the border, across the Danube into the Austrian Empire, and they get set up in a place called Karlovci, and they get their own little parliament there, a national assembly under which the patriarch, the former patriarch, and once metropolitans, and then future patriarchs again. It's complicated, don't worry. They set up shop there with a national assembly or a proto-national assembly, and they're essentially it's supposed to be the church sabor, and that's supposed to be their meeting place, but it becomes secular with time. So not only does the church have a headquarters in the Holy Roman Empire at Karlovci, but the secular Serbs have a headquarters there too, and they're all forced to meet together all the time for the Sremski Sabor in Karlovci. And that marries secular and church authority. In many ways, this is a very fascinating thing, because that's kind of what Dušan's empire had been built on. The Serbian kingdom before this empire was built on this marriage between church and state. It is so unbelievably intertwined, this church and state marriage, that it just continues as the Serbs flee into the Austrian Empire, which is kind of fascinating. I do wonder if that's something that the Austrian authorities did on purpose for that specific reason, to continue this marriage. But that seems counterintuitive, doesn't it? It feels like you wouldn't want to strengthen those links between secular and religious authority, but who knows? And yet, a third time this happens, these clans of Herzegovina and sort of central Bosnia and central Serbia are all like deciding that they're going to have meetings with the metropolitan, the bishop, in Cetinje. This is very strange, and I do wonder why that marriage between the church and the secular expression of authority happens all the time in these three different locations. I guess I answered my own question with the entire first half of this video. But anyway, the Metropolitan at Montenegro was the focal point of the meeting place, and then they start to have votes on who the next bishop will be, and that'll be like either recognized or whatever by the overall church, which is headquartered in Peć. And Montenegro itself, the territory of Montenegro, was actually administered in 4 separate small territorial units within the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't exercise all that much control the Montenegrin clans didn't exercise that much power outside of that specific area. The Ottomans controlled most of the towns, the big fortified towns, that kind of thing. They controlled most of that. So there was a small modicum of power that the clans exercised in a legalistic sense, but the Ottomans really control most of what's going on. And anytime the Montenegrin clans wanted to do anything, they needed the help of Venice, of course, and Venice was their link to the outside world, and that also enabled them to eventually get the help from Russia. This is like the tiniest little anchor point from which a rebirth of Serbia is to grow. And Montenegro is definitely the earliest place where that happens. Montenegro gets all the support from Venice, so whenever there was a time of war, there was support. The Montenegrin clans would lend troops to the Venetians, and they would go fight in their wars. And in times of peace, they would still cooperate with trade and that kind of thing. And the sending abroad of these Montenegrin people is a lot of what keeps the memory of the Serbian state alive from this early clan sort of territory, especially in the Russian court. There are so many Serbs in the Russian court through the 1600s, 1700s. They're really advocating for Serbia down, plucky little Serbia, and especially Montenegro down at the bottom there, to revive their state and their culture, that kind of thing. The Tsar of Russia eventually, starts to throw his weight around a lot more, wants to expand. Peter the Great, he wants to expand into the Baltic, he wants to expand into the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, and really try and expand Russia's borders. The Russians become obsessed with trying to take Constantinople to inherit the legacy. They're claiming to be the third Rome, Moscow's the third Rome, but they really would like to get a hold of the second Rome. They really want to take all of the former Orthodox territories back into their control. There's economic reasons why they would want to do that, obviously, to control those straits, to lead the ships out of the Black Sea would be great. But of course, there is a lot of spiritual necessity there too. So the Russians are very keen on helping out those little Orthodox communities down there in Montenegro and Serbia as a whole. And the monastery in Montenegro is burned down by the Turks during one of these wars with the Russians, because obviously they're going to fight on the Russian side. In 1712, the monastery is burned down, and this caused a lot of destruction. And then Venice went to war with the Turks as well in 1714 to 1718. The Montenegrins were big allies with them during this time, and also they started trying to formalize their relationship with the Ottomans and set up military leaders to better use them in warfare. But then Venice stops going to war with the Ottomans because, of course, they start shrinking and becoming corrupt, and they're not as powerful as they used to be. And the Montenegrins were like, "Oh, well, we'll have to rely more and more on Russia." And the Montenegrins very much start to see themselves as Montenegrins during this time, and they advocate heavily in Moscow for themselves. They are in the Russian court with the Russian nobility, with the Russian emperor, singing songs about Montenegro and its plight. They're really pouring their heart out and weeping on the floors of the Russian court to say, "Hey, we need help. Do not forget us. Do not forget plucky little Montenegro, please." There's a very strong advocacy and link between these two countries, and that is, of course, the rest is eventually history. and that is why the Ottomans turned themselves heavily against the Montenegrins, but under which the Montenegrins, with these powerful allies, are maintaining a strong sense of themselves and their independence. The interesting thing about Montenegro is a lot of the way it's able to control itself and a lot of the way it's able to express that independence is through its relationship between the borders of the state, the borders of these clans who are constantly obviously fighting, and the unifying force becomes the bishop. It becomes the metropolitan in the monastery. And eventually, he is elected to become the prince. He's become a monarch of the territory. And there's a legalistic way of expressing that, and it might be familiar to people who know a lot about Germany and the history of the Holy Roman Empire. It's called a prince-bishopric. And a prince-bishopric is basically unification between a bishopric and a monarchy to essentially say, we're going to be not only the leader of the church, but also the king of that area. And that, or prince in this case, of that area. And this is a very strange thing, because you think, why would you sort of marry those two things together? But of course, the Serbs are like, they've been doing that forever. If they could have, they would have married the idea of the church and monarchy into one person a long time ago during Dušan's rule. But there wasn't really a method of doing that, or it wasn't advantageous at the time, but it definitely became advantageous once the clans of Montenegro decided that they wanted the bishop to be their hereditary ruler. Of course, bishops are celibate, so what that means is that instead of being passed down to their kids, it becomes this like one specific family that become the prince bishops. It's handed over to another relative, and that's usually either like an uncle or a nephew or something like that. And so branches of the family would always have somebody on the throne as the prince bishop. So it becomes this hereditary elected position. And if that sounds strange to you, just remember the modern day state of the Vatican is very similar. It is a prince bishopric in the sense that, the Pope is the Bishop of Rome, but he is also the monarch of the Vatican state. He is an elected position by all the cardinals of the church. So he is the king, essentially the monarch of the Vatican state, and he exercises secular authority over the Vatican state, which was once the papal states, which you can see over here on the map in red. But the expression of their secular authority is as a monarchy, and their religious authority is as a bishop. And that's essentially what rules Montenegro for its entire history. Excuse me, my voice is really despairing, so I think we're going to have to end it there. And I think next time we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail. I don't actually know what we're going to talk about. I think we're going to maybe expand upon how the Serbian state from the roots of the Serbian state and the Montenegrin state would eventually coalesce during and after the Serbian Revolution, and how that eventually becomes the nation state that we know today. So if you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon or become a channel member on the main channel if you want to do it there. And then if you want to ask a question on the next week's episode, you can do it there as well if you want to guarantee that your question gets answered. The other way you can do it is obviously just if this is in the future and this channel has been finally monetized, then you can do so by super chats or that kind of thing, or the little super thanks feature. That's one of the best ways you can do it. The other way you can do it non-monetarily is you can just give the video a good old thumbs up and a share and a comment down below. And questions from last week's episode. So I didn't actually get any questions from last week's episode, so I did want to just quickly address one of the comments that I got on a previous episode. If you're in if you're viewing this one, so this is Narcoman Kina 142. So you left a comment on one of my videos talking about insisting on the Serbs being one people, and I asked you for clarification. You said that you assume all the Serbs operate and think as one peoples, which hasn't been the case for centuries. I honestly don't know where you got that feeling from. Where I suppose in saying things, in characterizing things as like the Serbs did this, the Serbs did that. Yes, I can kind of get that, but I think you might just be reading a little bit too deeply into it. If you want to clarify a little bit more, I'd be happy to talk about it on another episode. But yes, I don't think that the Serbs operated as one unified hive mind, if that's what you thought I was suggesting. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Thank you all for watching. So remember to support on Patreon or memberships, or do all the like and subscribe things, all of that good stuff, all of that good jazz. And I'll see you on the next one.